Epilogue. "Barkeep, another round for my new friend over here," the man said and slammed his palm on the countertop. The smacking sound made a reverberating godsmack that rang across the semi-uninhibited bar. The bartender pursued his vast bourbon offering. The bottles came in a colorful array of reds, browns, and burgundies. The bartender poured over the labels of bourbon and arrived at the cheapest one in the bunch. The bottle stuck out like a sore thumb. It had a handwritten label over a piece of duct tape, which read, "House Bourbon." "Ah, there you are," the bartender said while seizing his favorite bottom shelf bourbon. The bartender snagged the bottle from the bourbon rack. He stood across from the sergeant and carefully poured another shot of bourbon into the sergeant's sipping glass. The sergeant found it rather ironic, calling it a sipping glass. Was that supposed to make him feel like less of an alcoholic? The sergeant stared at the glass with a melancholic expression. He picked it up and swirled it around for a while. The bourbon made these large, concentric circles as it swirled in the glass. The bourbon had a faded hue of what surmounted to overpriced, watered-down soda with a splash of alcohol. "So, then what happened?" the mysterious stranger asked former Sergeant Mike Allen. Mike slugged back the drink and firmly slammed the glass down on the bar top. The bottom of the hard glass made a loud thud. No one in the bar batted an eye or so much as flinched a muscle. People at this place tended to keep to themselves, which is the main reason why Mike frequented this bar so often. The bar top was one of those modern countertops only relegated to upscale DC social clubs. He was frustrated by the fervor of the man fawning over his fantastical story. He knew it was hard to believe. That's why he was so forthcoming. Mike didn't see much utility in varnishing a story nobody would believe. The bar coached itself as a social club, which was one step removed from gentleman's bar, or something you'd find in a mafia movie. For DC standards, this place was kind of a dive bar. The bar top was about 30 feet long and made of faded fake off-white marble. "What is this? 20 questions?" Mike snapped back at the man and shoved his glass back to the bartender. The bartender took no offense to his rude, off-the-cuff gesture. Liquor tended to suspend formal platitudes and relinquish most people of normativity to pleasantries. He snatched the glass off the countertop and secured it under the spout of the bourbon. The bartender clearly took a lot of pride in his free pour. Bourbon flowed out of the bottle like tears falling from heaven. "Oh, no. Sorry to be so intrusive. I'm just captivated by your story. That's all," the man said slightly defensively. Mike clasped back onto the glass of bourbon and began to sulk over his drink. His companion started twirling his martini glass to mirror Mike's behavior. When he picked his glass up from the bar, he noticed a slight ring of condensation forming on the countertop. The man slid over a complimentary coaster for Mike to put under his glass. He thanked the man by casually continuing the conversation. "What happened? I'll tell you what happened. The building ended up collapsing on itself, like one of those seaside condo complex demolitions you'd see on cable TV. Instead of rebuilding, the government just decided to cover it all up, literally. They poured hundreds of tons of concrete over the site and just buried it," he explained. Mike started tapping on the brim of his bourbon glass as if he was lost in deep contemplation over the entire situation. He was clearly grappling with the reality of what he endured. He was clearly pondering the entire journey. He was clearly lost in deep thought over his conundrum. This whole exercise was rather cathartic for Mike, but he struggled retelling all the key details of the story. The way Mike figured it, if the military brass was able to bury the story, then why couldn't Mike? Sounds like a real clusterfuck." "You don't know the half of it, buddy. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The brass wanted to sweep this whole thing under the rug, so they granted me a medical discharge and kicked me to the curb. All things being considered, could have been worse, huh?" "That's the understatement of the century. Could have been a lot worse. In retrospect, a lot worse. I could have been rotting away in a cell at Fort Leavenworth." "Huh. I hear breakfast is pretty decent at Hotel Leavenworth. Tuesday they do silver dollar pancakes. Mike shut up for a second to think carefully about his next words. He chose them about as carefully as a newlywed couple buying their first home. The man's statement left a bad taste in his mouth, but Mike wasn't ruling out the bourbon amplifying the dissent of the conversation. I think the risk of any of this going down in public records wasn't a risk the brass wanted to take. All it would take is some over-eager reporter or a potential Senate hearing to make a mess of everything. God forbid someone filed a FOIA request. It was easier to discredit me and throw me to the wind. Huh, the man affirmed while sipping on his room-temperature appletini. It all sounds rather fantastical. Mercenaries, super soldier serum. Might even make a good buck. Right? Who would believe me? Oh yeah, some unarmed mercenary group was dumb enough to infiltrate a bioweapons lab on an island? Right. In the middle of a hurricane, no less. Yeah, who'd be that dumb? Come on, man, the man asked. Mike was unsure what to make of this guy. For the time being, he was making a great sounding board and freed up his bar tab. Yeah, who would be that dumb? Who indeed? Mike responded while pointing both of his thumbs back at him. Mike turned his back to the bartender and leaned up against the bar top. He started sipping his glass while scouting out the room for some warm company. He noticed the room was unusually quiet. Even for 8 o'clock p.m., it was quiet. Mike chalked it all up to his drunken paranoia and low-grade bourbon. So, what happened to the mercenary? Maddox? Yeah, Maddox, the man said curiously. The Coast Guard launched a large-scale manhunt, the biggest in naval history. Yeah? How'd they cover that up? It was dubbed a joint training exercise between local law enforcement and the Coast Guard and the Navy. Impressive, undoubtedly. So what? So did they end up finding her? She jumped out of a Black Hawk with no parachute, which was traveling somewhere in the ballpark of 200 miles per hour. What do you think they found? Fair enough, he replied. I mean, shit, even if somehow she managed to survive the fall into the ocean. And that's a big if. Big if, he interjected. If she somehow managed to swim to shore during a hurricane with no thermal gear on, you know what I think? No, not really. Can't say that I do. I think you're a severely undervalued asset, my friend. Really? Really, he said while finishing his martini. Well, I'd love to sit here and chat, but I've got to get back to work, the man said. What is it that you do exactly? Instead of an instant retort, the man produced a menacing smile. It's clear that Mike's story was making an indelible impression on the man. Mike figured he was some kind of military groupie, the kind that lived vigorously through extracting stories out of the veterans one drink at a time. What do I do? What do I do? That's an interesting question, Mike. Well, I'm an investment analyst of sorts. I find value where others do not. Oh, like a stockbroker or something? Something like that. A large man in a black suit leaned over to the man and surreptitiously whispered something in his ear. The way Mike figured it, the free drinks were about to end. Mike held up his glass as a demonstrative form of gratitude, like a best man holding up a glass for a toast. At the same time, Mike realized he was spilling his guts to a complete stranger. This guy was a total stranger, and that was something Mike had to solve. I didn't catch your name, friend. The man smiled ear to ear and slid his business card over to Mike Allen. Mike didn't bother looking at it immediately. He was still rather focused on his caramel-colored drink. At this point, the ice cubes had melted and watered down any remaining alcohol. That's because I didn't give it, friend, he replied back to the now-defunct former operator. Mike slugged the remainder of his drink and slammed the glass on the countertop. He snagged the business card off the countertop with his left hand and a handful of bar nuts with his right. The name is Billy. My friends call me Billy the Kid, he said with a shit-eating grin stained across his cheeks. Mike looked back at Billy and then looked down at his business card. He held the business card in his hand and tapped it against the bar top. If you ever need work, I'm always looking for good people. Stay in touch, Mike Allen. The end.